Today on r/MaliciousCompliance, one boss gets burned, one landlord panics, and one kid wins TV freedom. All because they followed orders a little too perfectly. Let's dive in.
Supervisor told me sarcastically to call the fire department. I did. I worked in retail in between jobs way back when, in the early 90s. Yeah, I'm old. Get off my lawn. It was December, at a major department store that's no longer around. I know that doesn't narrow it down, sorry. Anyway, they tried to cram as much product on the floor as possible, to the point that you couldn't walk through the aisles and had to twist and turn to get past the fixtures set up with product. I casually mentioned to a supervisor that if the fire department ever came in, they would close us down for the hazards and lack of egress. She was highly stressed and blurted out to me, "You know what? Then call the fire department." I held my hands up and said, "Easy." She assigned me my duties, and that was that. Well, she did tell me to call. On the way home, I stopped by a government building that had all sorts of agencies in it. I told the receptionist my situation, and she pointed to a phone on the wall. She told me to tell the operator I wanted the fire department, and they would patch me through to the station's non-emergency line. The fire chief himself answered. I told him how crowded it was and what the supervisor said. He had a good laugh and said they'd check it out. I was off the next day, but heard about it when I got back. The fire chief and a station house full of firefighters showed up to do an inspection. He told the store manager egress was being blocked and he'd have to remove a lot of the fixtures in the aisles. The store manager said he had orders from corporate. The fixtures stay. The fire chief assured him he would win the argument. The store manager stood his ground. Fire chief, "All right, boys, close them down." They evacuated the store, all 3 levels, and closed all entrances in December during prime Christmas shopping season. Although it wasn't a weekend day, it was still busy. The store manager tried to protest, and suddenly the sheriff's department started showing up. Long story short, they were closed for 5.5 hours, while the chief, store manager, and employees rearranged the store to acceptable levels. The supervisor never treated me differently, so I'm guessing she didn't remember the conversation. The store manager, surprisingly, did not get fired from corporate, but corporate was definitely not happy. About a week later, I was working with the store manager and supervisor when she asked why we couldn't do something a certain way. The store manager replied, "The fire department won't allow that." And that was it.
Now this is how you follow orders a little too well. Boss says, "Then call the fire department." And OP's like, "All right, don't tempt me." Next thing you know, firefighters are rolling in, shutting down Christmas like it's an emergency drill from Santa's workshop. The manager's out there arguing with the fire chief while customers are still holding shopping bags. 5.5 hours later, aisles are cleared, egos are smoked, and corporate's probably hyperventilating into a tinsel bag. Thank God the supervisor didn't remember that conversation. OP dodged trouble like a pro. Tell me in the comments, if your boss dared you like that, would you have made the call too? And speaking of fire departments, the next story is about a landlord who called the fire marshal on themselves.
Landlord maliciously complianced themselves. This happened a few years ago in my last apartment. My roommate and I were living in a basement place with upstairs neighbors, and the owner decided he wanted to sell. The upstairs neighbors ended up buying it and became our new landlords, and they were awful at it. I could fill a whole post with the amount of stuff they tried to get away with, but we're here to talk about one particular instance. But suffice it to say, they had no idea that landlords had responsibilities and simply saw us tenants as a source of income that should be ever growing, hence our rent suddenly spiking and why we left. But there was one time they maliciously complianced themselves. See, they had a habit of trying to push stuff on us that was blatantly illegal. Their first contract, for example, said among other things that they had the right to enter the apartment at any time they wanted and could go through our stuff if they wished because we were living on their property. I pointed out that this was highly illegal, and they grew very upset, saying, "Well, we'll see about that." This clause later suddenly became the real one before we signed. One day, however, our lone fire alarm stopped working. As dutiful tenants, we reached out and said, "Hey, the fire alarm stopped working." Their response was a predictable sort of, "So what? We need to have a working fire alarm," we replied, "and it's the landlord's duty to provide working fire alarms." "No, it's not. You want one, you get it. The law says otherwise." And here's where they maliciously complianced themselves. Possibly because they were getting tired of being corrected, they got snooty with this one. We got a very sarcastic response. Oh, it does it? Well, we'll just see what the Fire Marshal has to say about that. My roommate and I, upon receiving this message, burst out laughing. But they were serious. They thought they were going to contact the Fire Marshal, he was going to side with them, and then they could come down on us hard. I don't know what their expressions were when we said, okay, yeah, do that. However, the next morning, there was frantic knocking at our door. There stood the landlord and his family looking very concerned with a bag of brand new fire alarms, one for each room, and, if I recall correctly, even 2 spares. He begged to be let in outside of the 24-hour notice, saying it was an emergency. He had to put these alarms up right now. Trying not to laugh, we let them in, and they hurriedly put one in every single room, apologizing profusely for the delay and telling us, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I don't know how that meeting with the Fire Marshal went, or if they got him or someone else at their office, but their attitude painted a pretty clear picture of the ultimate result. They complied maliciously, thinking they'd called our bluff. Whoops.
Oh, this is beautiful. These landlords really thought they had the upper hand. Let's call the Fire Marshal. He'll prove us right. Yeah, about that. Cut to the next morning. Frantic knocking, panic faces, and a bag full of fire alarms like they're Santa for safety codes. You just know that phone call went horribly wrong. They probably got schooled so hard the Fire Marshal gave them homework. It's the fastest 180 I've ever heard. Went from, we know the law, to, we're so sorry, please let us install alarms in every room. And honestly, that's the best kind of compliance, where you own yourself. Tell me in the comments, what do you think that Fire Marshal said to make them sprint over like that? And after all that fire drama, let's cool it down with a kid who turned one unfair rule into total victory.
If you're going to watch TV, you have to include your little sister. When I was around 10, my parents had a rule. If the TV is on, your little sister has to be allowed to watch too if she wants. I usually wanted to watch cartoons, and she always wanted those annoying sing-along shows. Arguments every day. One Saturday morning, I turned on the TV, plopped her down in front of it, and immediately put on a wildlife documentary about ants. I sat there with the remote in hand, patiently explaining every single scene to her like it was the most exciting thing in the world. She lasted about 6 minutes before running off. My dad poked his head in, saw her already running off to play, and asked why the TV was still on. I told him she didn't want to stay. I don't know if my parents knew what happened, but for some reason, they quietly dropped the "you must include her" rule for the rest of that summer. Cartoons were mine again.
This kid deserves an award for tactical brilliance. Parents say, if you watch TV, your sister watches too. So OP's like, cool, hope she likes ants. 6 minutes later, little sis is running for her life while OP's sitting there giving a TED talk on insect colonies. That's not rebellion, that's genius compliance. No yelling, no grounding, just pure calculated boredom as a weapon. And the best part? Parents quietly retire the rule like, yeah, maybe let's not do that again. Cartoons reclaimed. Mission accomplished. Tell me, what's the smartest loophole you ever pulled as a kid? And that wraps up today's perfectly legal chaos on r/MaliciousCompliance. If those cold calculated comebacks hit the spot, give that thumbs up button a lil love. Got opinions? I know you do. Drop them in the comments. I read everything, even the spicy ones. And hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button and turn on the bell so you never miss another snarky saga. I'll see you in the next one. It's gonna be wild. Bye!